Dr. Megan Best is a physician and bioethicist in her native Australia. She is a lecturer at the University of New South Wales and a prolific author and speaker on stem cell research, cloning, medical ethics, and palliative care.
Well, I don't think anyone knows how many unborn human beings lose their lives through human agency each year. Internationally, through just abortion and IVF, it's in the tens of millions. These are numbers much too big for us to grasp in terms of human lives, so I'm conscious we've been talking about much bigger numbers today. But our rapidly developing ability to manipulate the unborn means that we can now create human embryos outside the womb for fertility treatments, but also for research. Instances where we have no intention of giving that human being a chance of being allowed to develop and come to birth. We have contraceptives which interrupt embryonic development, and elective abortion is widespread. In the literature, arguments are being made for the need to screen every unborn child for disability, with the understanding that only the normal ones will be allowed to come to term. And I'm not sure who's in the audience, and I don't want to insult your intelligence, but so we're all on the same page, let's start with a biology lesson, and then we'll briefly consider the technology which is involved in the current debates, and then we'll consider the history of ethical arguments that's brought us to where we are now. This is a cross-section of the female reproductive system, and this is how the majority of us are conceived. Human conception begins with the fertilization of an egg by a sperm, which causes the formation of a single cell called a zygote. Now, the female human gamete is actually called an oocyte. Egg is a more culinary term, but I'll use it today because of familiarity. From this point, the formation of the zygote, we have development through a continuum from pregnancy to childhood to adulthood. And all the DNA required for full maturity of the human being is present. So in embryology terms, in that single cell, we have a member of the species Homo sapiens. Cell organization begins immediately, even before the genome is activated by those epigenetic factors we've been hearing about. So we're not dealing with what is often called just a clump of cells. You have to be careful of the language used in this topic because it's often used to mislead the public. Zenica Goet's team in the UK demonstrated that the patterning information in the egg is related to the sperm's entry point at fertilization and persists as the embryo develops. That means that where the sperm goes in the wall of the egg decides the whole development axis of the embryo from that stage on. The first cell division occurs within 24 hours of conception, and cellular division continues while the embryo travels down the fallopian tube towards the uterus. By this time, it will be comprised of 4 different types of cell. An embryo is pictured here at the 32 cell stage. The inner cell mass, where the stem cells come from, is red, and they have coloured 2 types of trophectoderm, blue and green. And these tissue types correlate with what will later become the embryo and its supporting structures. In day 5 to 6, we have a blastocyst, which is like a hollow ball of cells with the inner cell mass sort of stuck to the inside, and that's the point at which embryos will be harvested for the stem cells. At the end of the first week, implantation begins, where the embryo attaches to the uterine wall and the mother's blood supply starts to nourish it. Sadly, this doesn't always occur successfully, in which case you'll have a very early miscarriage. In week 3, the future spinal cord begins to develop and heart tubes begin to fuse. The blood cell production of the embryo begins. In week 4, the embryo measures 3 millimeters in length and its heart begins to beat at a regular rhythm. We have development of brain, thyroid, eyes and ears beginning. Now, you once looked like this, and I think this is a bit of the PR problem of the embryo. Week 5, we have continued development of eyes, mouth, nose, sinuses, lungs, arms, hands and legs begin to grow, and the embryo's own blood supply starts to circulate. In week 6, the embryo measures 8 millimetres in length, and we have beginning of formation of the feet, ears, nipples and bones. We have continued development of the face and the brain. Arms and legs have lengthened with foot and hand areas distinguishable, and these have digits but they may still be webbed. In week 7, the embryo measures 1.3 centimetres in length. The trunk lengthens and straightens. The upper limbs are no longer straight, they're starting to bend at the elbow, and the kidneys start to develop. In week 8, the embryo measures 3 centimetres in length. The facial features continue to develop, with eyelids and ears taking shape, the heads more rounded, and the beginnings of all essential external and internal structures are present at this time. So you can see, while even at the embryo stage, an enormous amount of development has already taken place. Now at 8 weeks, we stop calling it an embryo and start calling it a fetus. That's just the terminology. And at 3 months, the fetus reaches a length of just over 8 centimetres. The face and body are now formed and all organs are beginning to function. They just need to mature for the remainder of the pregnancy. At 4 months, tooth enamel is developing and the pregnant woman can detect fetal movement. The fetus is producing its own hormones, and by now the baby can feel pain. Some researchers suggest this occurs as early as 17 weeks. Certainly it's there by 24 weeks. At 5 months, the fetus might have hiccups from swallowing too much amniotic fluid, and the two sides of the brain begin to differentiate asymmetrically. At 6 months, the hair starts to grow, gas exchange is possible in the lungs, and the sense of smell is functioning. The eyes begin to detect light and they can produce tears. And then things start to get a bit squashy, and then we have a newborn at term. Now, I don't think many people would disagree that a newborn baby is a human being who deserves care. So my question is, if this is a human, when did it stop being a human? I would suggest that as it had everything it needed for full development at the time of that first cell, that it's at the zygote that we now have a full human being. And this is certainly the opinion of embryologists, the specialists in this field. Internationally preeminent embryologist Ronan O'Hara-Healy has no doubt that in biological terms we're dealing with a human being from the time of fertilization. He writes, although life is a continuous process, fertilization is a critical landmark because under ordinary circumstances a new genetically distinct human organism is formed when the chromosomes of the male and female pronuclei blend in the egg. This remains true even though the embryonic genome is not actually activated until 2 to 8 cells are present at about 2 to 3 days. During the embryonic period proper, milestones include fertilization, activation of the embryonic genome, segregation of embryonic from extra-embryonic cells, implantation, the appearance of the primitive streak and bilateral symmetry. Despite the various embryological milestones, however, development is a continuous rather than a saltatory, that means a stepwise process. Hence the selection of prenatal events would seem to be largely arbitrary, and we'll pick up on that latter point in a moment. What he's saying is that since everything it needed to grow was present at the first cell and it directed its own growth since then, it would be arbitrary to say that human life began at any time after fertilization. So biologically, when the sperm and egg joined, human life began. Thankfully, this is no longer contested in informed debate. With regard to abortion and embryo destruction, it's no longer an argument of whether we're dealing with developing humans. It's now a matter of when or whether they deserve protection. But as you know, a lot of public debate is not well informed, so sadly we need to continue to proclaim the humanity of the human embryo and fetus. And today I'll focus on the current arguments regarding the embryo because they're a bit more complex. So how did the bioethical debate develop? How has the public addressed the question of how we treat unborn human beings in the 21st century? Well, at the centre of the public debate is disagreement over whether developing humans deserve to be protected, whether they have a right to life. And the disagreement can be, I think, most easily understood when we consider different ways of defining the embryo. First, we have the biological definition, and as we've already seen, there is no doubt in biological terms that we're dealing with a human being from the time of fertilization. The embryo, from the time it's created, is a unified, unique, dynamic, self-directed whole. This is not even vaguely controversial in scientific terms. Now, humans have human rights, don't they? Destructive research on human embryos contravenes years of human rights declarations which since World War II have been designed to protect the welfare of human research subjects. So you've got the Nuremberg Code 1946, Helsinki Declaration 1964. In this country we have the Belmont Report in 1979. The Council of Europe Convention of 1997 specifically prohibits the destructive research on human embryos and the creation of human embryos for research. The United Nations issued a statement in 2005 calling for a ban on human cloning on grounds of it being contrary to human dignity. But in many countries, including my own, when the political desire to allow embryonic stem cell treatment was there, the statutes in the way were simply removed. But if there is no doubt biologically that a human embryo is just that, human, how is its wanton destruction justified? Well, this question is generally discussed in terms of the philosophical definition. Protagonists of destructive embryo research have suggested that protection is only due to human persons and that personhood is not achieved on merely biological grounds. The concept of human personhood probably had its roots in Greek thought, ancient Greek thought, and for much of its history, personhood was understood to mean an individual being of a rational nature. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century said that one who possesses a human nature possesses a rational nature, even if they're unable to freely exercise it at the time. Therefore, it was considered that all human beings were human persons. And this is certainly the view that's been held for the most of human history. Until recently, it would have been inconceivable to say that a human being was not a human person. But the definition of personhood underwent a change last century when political expediency intervened. In 1954, the Reverend Joseph Fletcher published an account of human personhood which claimed that human persons must not merely possess a rational nature, but be able to exercise it at the time. Now, Fletcher's definition was driven less by scientific discovery than the political debate around abortion. He wanted to justify legal abortion, and obviously if the embryo was not a fully human person, then abortion would be much easier to justify. Fletcher argued that what sets humans apart from other animals is their possession of reason. He claimed that this is what grounds human dignity and is signified by the term person. He went on to argue that if the human embryo is not a human person, that it doesn't merit legal protection. So for Fletcher, the possession of human nature with the latent ability to reason, that is, the ability to express reason at another time, the latent ability was insufficient, and thus not only embryos and fetuses, but also newborn infants would have to be classed as non-persons. And in his writing, he explicitly accepted that infanticide, the killing of infants, would be justifiable on these grounds. Those in prolonged coma or suffering dementia would likewise be excluded from personhood status. So you can see how dangerous this thinking can become. In response to this argument, I'd suggest that surely this is an unacceptable way to decide which humans deserve protection in our legal system. Intuitively, we know that killing infants is wrong. Traditionally, those who are unable to speak for themselves and who thus become socially vulnerable are seen to be in more need of protection rather than less, which suggests that we should stick with the standard definition of person, that is, a living human being. If you're a human being, you possess a human nature, which means you have a rational nature, even if you're unable to express it at the time. There are many theories regarding the point at which personhood begins or when independent moral status is acquired, and they're there on the slide. You'll see that generally these theories require the unborn child to have particular features or abilities before being considered worthy of protection. And you'll note that some of them aren't actually intrinsic qualities of the embryo. For example, quickening. A woman in her first pregnancy will always determine quickening later than her more experienced sister. Viability changes as our technology on resuscitating newborns changes. The timing of birth depends on all sorts of factors. But debate on these competing theories continues without any sign of resolution. And the 14-day rule has been confirmed as an ethical principle by various government ethics committees, including United States federal committees and Australian parliamentary reviews. But the interesting thing to notice in the literature about the 14-day rule is that most philosophers, whether they support embryo research or not, don't support the arguments in the Warnock report. According to them, either the pre-14-day embryo is being unjustifiably exploited because the human embryo deserves protection from the start, or research on embryos is being unjustifiably limited because they don't. How do we decide which is correct? Certainly not by asking the researchers. So let's stop for a minute to see what we have so far as the basis for our decisions about the treatment of unborn humans. Out-of-date science, with very little, if any, public discussion of how intricately we now know the human embryo is fashioned from the time of fertilization. And secondly, we have philosophical debates with an agenda to create an artificial standard of what a human being must achieve before it deserves legal protection. But the philosophical argument ultimately underlying this thinking is the ethical theory of consequentialism. This is the argument that right and wrong can be decided by looking at the consequences of an act alone. The end justifies the means. Our community has decided that while the destruction of developing humans may be seen to be regrettable, the potential consequences of the destruction, whether it's medical cures through embryonic stem cell treatment, a child of one's own through IVF, or freedom from an unwanted pregnancy, justifies their use. Some proponents would go so far as to suggest that the potential benefits make it unethical not to destroy human embryos, and that those that raise ethical questions may lack compassion for those who are suffering. But what about our worldview? Well, Christians have a moral compass, and that is the Bible. We can learn a lot about how God wants us to treat humans by considering the way that we've been made. The creation story in Genesis shows us that all humans are made in the image of God, and this is the basis on which we are all to be treated equally and with dignity. In Genesis 1 it says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Human beings have been uniquely made in the image and likeness of God. This sets us apart from all other creatures which were made according to their kinds. In contrast to the modern philosophical view that personhood must be earned, the Bible teaches that our personhood is inherent because of the nature of the God whose image we reflect. We are to treat all human beings with respect for the whole of their lives, regardless of their particular characteristics. It is not our respect that gives them dignity. It is because they have innate dignity that we owe them respect. But when does it begin, the life of a human being? Well, there's no key verse in the Bible which tells us exactly when life begins. The Bible is not a scientific textbook. But human life certainly begins before birth. The Bible makes the link between conception and birth in many places, such as in Genesis 4. Adam lay with his wife Eve and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. In Isaiah 46, God speaks to Israel as you whom I have upheld since you were conceived and have carried since your birth. Jesus' presence on the earth is described as beginning when the Virgin conceived through the Holy Spirit, and the incarnation is a powerful reminder of the status that embryos hold in the eyes of God. Because in order for him to take on true humanity, Christ had to commence life as an embryo rather than a fully functioning human. And the Bible describes the relationship we have with God while we're still in the womb, such as during our formation. Psalm 139 says, "For you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made." And Job 10 has a similar description. This is only a sample of the verses which illustrate these points. I go through a lot more in the book. But there is no doubt that unborn human beings are recognized in the Bible as one who is capable of a relationship with God. Furthermore, do you want me to just tell you? Furthermore, in Exodus 20 it says we should not kill innocent human beings regardless of the consequences. It's one of the 10 Commandments. And the Bible tells us that the value of a human being is based on our own understanding of morality as given to us by the God who made us. We were all once embryos too. But the basic issues at the heart of this debate is the moral status of the embryo. What are our options? Well, with regards to stem cell research, it's now known that it's possible for the research to proceed without the destruction of human embryos. Since the discovery of human embryonic stem cells, we've also realised we have adult stem cells, and we've had the discovery of induced pluripotent stem cells, or iPS cells. And the discovery was not completely unexpected, because in the history of Western science, ethical limits have always led to imaginative solutions rather than remaining barriers to discovery. However, even in the light of all these discoveries, most scientists will reject suggestions that embryonic stem cell treatment should be stopped. The withdrawal of permissive legislation and the redirection of funding required to transform the current landscape is a formidable, though not impossible, task. I think we probably need a very high-profile celebrity to get behind us. And I've got a great slide of Dr. Oz telling Oprah all about iPS cells, and she looks very excited. So who knows? Certainly we must continue to promote the community debate. We need more transparency from our scientists so that they are accountable to community standards of what is right and wrong. We need to let our community know that things have changed. Our understanding of embryology has progressed. The justifications of the past are no longer valid. It's time to think again. In particular, we want our legislators to realise what their decisions involve. Personhood debates need to be acknowledged for what they are. Just an excuse to justify what some people wanted to do anyway. But we live in a fallen world. The only real cure for a materialistic worldview is the gospel. Failing this, how do we get consensus as a community? Well, I would suggest it's just not possible. In the end, the moral status of the embryo is not a fact, but a value. And we will each of us decide what is valuable to us on the basis of our worldview. In every ethical decision, you have motivation leading to your intention, which leads to the act, which has consequences. Those who would pursue destructive embryo research are considering consequences only. Those opposed are concerned to the act itself. There are some things that will always be wrong, regardless of the consequences. It is wrong to kill an innocent human being. They will never meet because they're talking about different things. The two parties are passing like ships in the night. There is no compromised position. But in a pluralistic society such as ours, we can't just ignore the people we disagree with. We need to consider all the different views in our community. And when there's no consensus, we take a vote, and he with the most votes wins. We need to keep trying to win that vote. But when we do so, we don't want polarisation. We want to be able to talk to each other about the intricacies of this science. We want people to actually listen to what we're saying and not put them off before we open our mouths. And we have to realise that when we talk about unborn humans and our treatment of human embryos and human fetuses, that we are touching on painful issues that are experienced by real people, and we need to do it gently and with tact and with great love. But our message is a positive one. Let's keep saying yes to human life at every stage of development and care for this being who is fearfully and wonderfully made. Thank you.
To view this program again and share it with your friends, and to learn more about this series, these conferences, and the intersection of science and faith, please go to www.pensmore.org.
The proceeding was brought to you by the Pensmore Foundation and NRB TV.